Knowing how to accurately read and interpret heat maps is critical to making great decisions with your sound systems. No matter whether you're a designer who is coming up with data and making decisions based on the data that you're seeing, or if you're an end client when an integrator or designer is presenting you with this data, knowing to be able to see if it's accurate and telling you what you are actually care about with the design itself. There are a lot of ways to manipulate it with the signal types, the weighting, the amount of sources you're using, there's smoothing, there's banding, there's all these different ways that the data can be presented. And today, I want to give you a foolproof way to look at all the variables and know exactly what to ask for if you're the end client, or if you want to learn more about design yourself, know how you should use this data to better inform your decisions and know how to manipulate it to show what you want it to do. Excited to walk through it. At the very end, I'm going to be giving you a list of all the questions I would ask about any of the data shown to me if I were to evaluate it, just to make sure I understand what is happening. So make sure and stick around for that. But we're going to be going through step by step each of these different variables I want to walk you through and how to manipulate them and how to read them clearly. Let's jump in. First up, what data does heat maps convey to us? What is it trying to tell us? So to go back to where these are anchored into, this is literally a temperature or heat map of the entire world annualized over the entire year. So where I live, right here in Arkansas, if I draw over to here, that's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit is what it annualizes over the entire year. Obviously, during the summers, it gets up to 100 degrees, and that cold snap that happened a few years ago where the entire power grid got shut down for a while, it got down to 20 below. So it's a huge range, but this is looking at over the average of an entire year in my region, what's it showing me? And it's showing me the scale here, that if it goes to a deeper red color, it's getting hotter. And if it's going towards a cooler temperature, is getting, or a cooler color, it is getting cooler in temperature. This is the exact same thing with our SPL maps. If it's getting more red, it's getting louder. It's going towards blue, it's getting softer. So the absolute color itself doesn't really matter. What I'm mainly concerned with is the uniformity. So that begs the question, the uniformity of what? So here is what we're actually measuring is the SPL, or sound pressure level. This is measured in pascals, that's the actual unit, but we rarely talk about the unit since we are using the decibel scale. So the decibel scale is a relative scale. So what we're starting with is the minimum sound level that's super, super soft that the human ear can detect in a really quiet environment. And this was decided from some really smart scientists a while back. And then the top of that scale is the threshold of pain, or before our ears literally start to kind of break down and not be able to decipher what's happening, is really, really loud. So something that is 1 decibel loud is incredibly soft, upwards of 120, 130 decibels before it is painful for the human ear. So a normal rock concert might run anywhere between 95 and 105, depending on the material. Again, when I'm mixing at my church, I'm usually running about 89, 90, so nothing crazy. And I want to be specific, 90 dB A-weighted over usually about a 1-minute period during a loud chorus. Again, I want to be specific here. So again, you can even see that how we unpack this word SPL, we have to have a lot of qualifiers to it. We have to attach different things we mean about weighting and where it is over the audience level. So that's what I really want to do, is untangle some of this. But at a high level, SPL is showing me the change over an audience area. This technically could be any area, but we usually care about it in our audience, with a known signal type and a defined frequency range. So we'll step through all of that. So why are SPL maps helpful to us? Ultimately, they help me see variances in level and tonality throughout the audience area. And that's important to me as a system designer, because I want to design low variance systems. I do not want it to sound vastly different in the front row versus the back row, or in the far left of the audience versus the middle. I want to make it very similar throughout the entire audience, and I have certain tolerances or ranges that I use to make that happen. So at the highest level, the question it is answering when I'm looking at these maps is, how consistent is the listening experience across my audience? So let's unpack a real world example. This is Crossway Church in Sulphur, Oklahoma. I did a site visit there a few weeks ago, and I'm designing a new system for them. I tuned their current system in the interim, but they'll be getting a new one here, maybe in less than a couple years or so. And I want to show you a design I was working on and show you the SPL mapping I have for them as an example, because I want to show you as many real world examples as possible. So this is the design that I've come up with. We're looking at a couple different brands, but one of them is the JBL SRX 906s, those boxes. So as you can see, I've modeled it here. I've got two hangs, a left and a right, and they are 9 boxes each at that splay angle. And in the center, I've got 3 of the B18 subs, with the center one being reversed to give us a nice cardioid pattern with those center subs. We're also looking at the Kiva 2s from Acoustics and maybe some D&B T-Series boxes. All that is beside the point, but I just really like what Venue Synthesis, or JBL's newest software in this iteration, what we're able to do with the mapping data here, and excited to unpack it for you. So this begs the question, what clarifying details should we be asking for? Again, it just looks like, hey, here's some green and some blue on the, on the mapping. What does that all mean? So let's define those details. So the first is we need to make sure we have the audience area and make it accurate. And the second is what type of sources are we using? What speakers are on right now? Number 3, the signal type, frequency range, and weighting. I tried to break these up, but it really makes sense to have them all together. But if we're measuring a system, what are we sending through it? What frequency range are we paying attention to? And what weighting, maybe A weighting, Z weighting, C weighting, across the spectrum are we using to look at the data? Number 4 is the scale. So is this the absolute or relative? So we can look at the data where, at this point in the room, it has 90 dB A weighted, or we don't really care about the absolute value. Do we just care that this in the middle of room is 3 dB down versus the front row? That's definitely, both are great ways of looking at it. It just depends what type of question you want to answer. Then also the divisions in the data. Is this full resolution where it's very smoothly showing us the level change? Or is it just 3 dB steps? Is it 6 dB? That's a really important one. Again, we'll be stepping through all these much more slowly, but want to give you a high level overview. Number 5 is processing. What presets, EQ, any gain shading is available on the box. And number 6 is looking at whether the calculations are showing you any of the acoustic changes, or are there any complex summation between the boxes? For instance, can I see power alleys and valleys with the subwoofers? All right, so let's slow down and step through all of these. The first is our audience area. So I want to look and see how accurate is my drawing. So how Venue Synthesis works is you actually do it in SketchUp first, and then you can import it, or that's one of the ways you can get data into it. And so I actually took a picture of the printed out architectural plans, is what you see here. I made a PDF of it, made it nice and flat, and I drew these lines to simulate the chair layout. And you might see that right here, you see a couple chairs that are in the audience area. It's because I was on site and actually measured where they currently have their chairs and made sure that this accurately represented what was happening in the real world. This is what's great about a site visit and getting to know how the space is being used. You can't always get that privilege, but it was nice to have that. I also drew the stage as well, just so we could have that for reference, and the back wall to give a sense of space. So once I had that, we had to define it within these audience areas, and now we're in the Venue Synthesis software, that this audience area, I chose it to be a standing audience versus a seated audience. You can say within a normal church service, people are going to be standing and sitting, but since standing is closer to the speakers, therefore reducing the range ratio, I want to optimize for the harder job versus seated. And most folks end up evaluating systems while they're standing up, not sitting down when they're listening to it. And I feel like they have a more critical lens over what it sounds like with music than with dialogue. If it's going to sound really good standing up with music, I'm willing to bet if you're sitting down, the dialogue is going to be clear as well. So you want to make sure your area is accurately mapped out. You want to define a standing or seated audience. Then these days, I'm also including the stage. So this shows me how much energy is coming back on the stage. And this is important if I'm doing a cardioid subarray or even just normal line array or point source deployment. I can predict what's happening. Again, we haven't talked at all about what these colors mean, what's the weighting, what's the range, what's the steps. But in general, we can see this deeper color here in the audience means more energy is getting out in the audience versus the stage. Once we defined our audience area and its qualities, we move on to sources. Sources means what speakers are active right now with this measurement I am looking at. So here on the left, I can go up to our groups. Right now, I only have the house right main, and this shows me its coverage pattern. So this is good to see if this is only covering the zone that I want it to cover. Again, right now I have it with pink noise, and that's A-weighted. We'll get to that, I promise. But just to give some clarity that what you are looking at right now. And here's what this would look like with both speakers on. So this is a solo, main, left, and right, no subs. So we can look at the difference here of like how this main's covering this half of the room and main left is covering the left half of the room. And now let's look at the solo of the subwoofers. And so this is broadband pink noise at the moment with no A weighting, and I'm seeing what the subwoofers are doing. So this kind of helps me subdivide the system and see what's happening. This is pretty self-explanatory here, but when looking at any sort of measurement, it's really just by looking at the speakers here, it's hard to tell, well, what speaker is making this heat map here. So always make sure that is noted in any design documents that you deliver, or when you're looking at it, ask the integrator or designer what's happening there. Now let's move on to signal type, frequency range, and weighting. So with signal types, we're asking what kind of audio signal and at what level are we feeding into our system for measurement? When we'll go over these different types. And so different signal types help us answer different questions. So the main ones that we're going to be working with is a sine wave, so an individual single frequency, pink noise, which is equal energy per octave from 0 or 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz, since that's the range of human hearing. We have band limited pink noise, so that is pink noise only limited to a specific range. We have pink noise IEC 60268, which is basically a tilted version of pink noise that more resembles musical content. We have M noise, now known as AES 75. This is developed by Meyer Sound first and then more or less given to the AES to be able to use as a testing procedure. It's very similar to IEC 60268 as far as its spectral content, but the crest factor actually increases with frequency. We'll unpack that. Then we have male and female speech IEC. So the IEC developed these test signals to simulate the clarity of male and female speech. And all these are available within Venue Synthesis. So if I go down here to the generator type, I have been using pink noise so far with what I've shown you, but I can see all these different ways. So let's step through each of this. Right now, I've got main right soloed with a sine wave at 500 hertz. So that's just showing me at that single frequency what is happening. So we can see the yellow is more intense, then moves to the light green, then the green. And I will say for all these measurements, each color change is a 6 dB step. So that's 6 dB, that's 6 dB, that's 6 dB. So we can, of course, draw over here and look at the scale. But I'm not really concerned right now what this data is showing me as far as absolute SPL. Only really care about the relative SPL right now. So that is 3 color changes. So that might be 0, -6, then -12 from that point. So here are the subs. This is a single sine wave at 63 hertz. So it's hottest right there, it moves out and it moves out. And now I'm going to turn on main right. I'm going to do a 1/3 of an octave. So this would be the same as taking a 31 band graphic EQ'd, only turning up 4K right there. And that's the solo main right. And we can see it's doing a pretty good job covering. And now I'm going to look at this over 1 octave and we see that change. And this is basically broadening that out to be an octave wide. And now we broaden it out even more to look at a bigger part of the spectrum to be 3 octaves wide. And this is still centered at 4K. And I like 4K as a proxy for high frequency coverage. It's not the end all be all, but it is helpful information nonetheless. And then let's widen it out even more to be 5 octaves. So if we look at all of these, this is 4K in the upper left, 3rd octave, moving on to 1 octave, 3 octaves, and 5 octaves. So we can see they all show us something similar, but how much other frequency content is taken into account can give us some helpful data. Now let's look at main right with pink noise, and it's going to be broadband or full range. So this is the entire operating range of the speaker, and I happen to know that this speaker has the 80 hertz crossover or frequency divider engaged right now. We'll get to that in a little bit, but this is the coverage map with 6 dB separation with pink noise. So it is obviously has a lot spilling onto the stage because it's taking into account lower and lower frequencies that have a harder time being steered, so they're going to balloon out versus a beam. So that is looking at things from a broadband perspective. And now I can check this A-weighted box and have an A-weighting filter put on it to more closely resemble what the human ear is going to perceive as loudness. So any of the OSHA measurements that you're going to be seeing, what they care about is A-weighted, because that is really what the human ear is most sensitive to. And this is the graph or curve that we're looking at. C-weighting, we were just using what's technically Z weighting or no weighting at all, but A weighting shows that right here, starting at 1K, we have a pretty steep drop off that gets rid of low, mids, and lows respectively. So if I'm looking at intelligibility and what the human ear is going to track onto, A weighting is a helpful proxy. So to compare the two, we've got broadband or full range here on the left, and then A weighted here on the right. And the absolute SPL is going to be less, of course, since we're filtering out a bunch on A-weighted. But you can see the shape of the coverage is much different when we're taking into account more of where the speaker is able to be directional in the upper frequencies versus it ballooning out in lower frequencies. But the longer and longer line array that we have within reason, we're able to steer that energy more and more, which is their main advantage. So moving on a little bit more to the M noise versus the other test signals that we have. I said earlier that one of the biggest differences is the spectral tilt. So if pink noise is those purple dots right here, we see that the other test signal, the MLT426B, or the one from the IEC that's available in venue synthesis, has a very similar tilt to M noise, but then falls off steeply. But M noise hangs on a little bit longer in the high frequencies. But the biggest shift is that the crest factor increases. That means the difference between the peaks and the average signal increases with frequency, which is very close to what music does. And so a tambourine hit is going to have a higher dynamic range than lower frequency instruments. So that's why M noise was created, to test loudspeakers under normal musical content conditions. So that's why they made that sort of spectral tilt, as well as increasing crest factor at the high frequencies. This is currently not available within venue synthesis, but we can use the similar, the IEC 426B test signal to serve as a proxy here in a little bit. So what does that look like? So I could go down here to the bottom and I choose pink noise IEC 60268. And what I can do is increase the gain up to 11 dBu. So why there? Well, it starts at 0. What that does is it sends these mains into limit. So the beauty of working with a software that has all of the products within its own ecosystem, that it knows that since this speaker has a built-in amplifier, it's a closed network. So it knows that when it gets a certain signal type, it knows when it's going to start going to limit. So since we have that available to us, I can drive the speaker into limit with a dedicated signal right here. I know when it's doing it when I see these orange lights. And the first time I see the orange lights was right here at plus 11 dBu. I had it A-weighted, since that's what I most care about in regards to SPL. And I can see here right in the middle of the orange, that gets me to 108.6 decibels. So with musical content at that much of a signal coming into my speaker is pushing it to the onset of limiting, that is the max SPL. I could technically bring it 1 dB under for it to not hit limit and know that's my maximum linear amount of SPL, so that would be 107.6. I can then extrapolate from here and know that, okay, this is 6 dB range, minus 6 is 102.6, minus 6 is 96.6, and so on. So I can now see what is the maximum SPL from this system with musical content, and that's how I figured it out. Moving on to the last of our test signals, This is male speech IEC, so it's a band-limited noise that is shaped to mimic the clarity aspects of a male voice, and then moving on to a female voice. So with this system, I would have more even coverage according to this test signal with the female voice than I do male. Male voices typically get lower, and so I need to have better steering at lower and lower frequencies to meet this criteria. It's still doing pretty well, but I could optimize it further with a longer array. Now let's move on to scale. We've hinted at this some, want to dive deeper here. So this is full resolution, pink noise, A-weighted. So down here in venue synthesis is where I'm able to change it from either full resolution, 3 dB steps, or 6 dB steps. So I can, again, determine this is full resolution, the signal type is pink noise, and I have it A-weighted, and this shows a smooth gradient from those colors. So it's a smoother rainbow, which to me is oftentimes harder to read and understand. So I actually prefer it to be in steps that help me make more sense of the data. So I've now switched it back to where we have been for the majority of this video in 6 dB steps. This is not my default, but just makes it easier to understand now. And this is pink noise A-weighted. So again, we look at these colors and I'm automatically looking at 3 different clarifications I have to know. This is 6 decibel steps, it is a pink noise signal, and it is A-weighted. And now we move to 3 dB steps. So this is finer granularity than we're looking at. So each color change is now 3 dB. So here, 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 here. And again, it's pink noise A-weighted. So helpful to know. And now let's compare all 3 of them. So this is full resolution, 6 decibel steps, 3 decibel steps. So now know that, yes, indeed, with more and more precision, this would be the loudest portion of this array's coverage. You can move farther out. Ideally, I would make the entire audience the exact same coverage down within a 1 dB tolerance, but that's really, really hard to do unless you have a very specific set of parameters available to you with the room and the array. But within this is a good enough proxy for me. This is success if that speaker zone's coverage within plus or minus 3 dB or 6 decibel coverage. So we are in good shape right there. Now we return to being able to look at the absolute versus relative decibel values. So here on the left is absolute. So it's showing me like, okay, that color on the map is 97 dB. And I was assuming here I had it A-weighted in pink noise. So that's just showing you that would be 97 at that color. Again, why I can do this is a closed system. It knows what speaker it is. It knows what amplifier is with it. It knows the signal level, the signal type, and the level that's going into it. So it can give us those numbers. If you don't really care about it, you can go over here and just look at attenuation or the relative values. So that just shows you on the equivalent map that anything that's that color is the top of it. And as soon as we move to this green color, we're between 6 and 12 dB down, and the same thing with turquoise and blue. So this is from venue synthesis. This is from Map3D. Map3D can also show you these absolute values. I was just comparing how they look here. Now let's move on to processing. So I want to make sure that with the prediction that I am seeing with the mapping, I know under what processing conditions is being shown. So one of them is a speaker preset. So this could be an FIR that's loaded up on a speaker. This could be a crossover that's loaded up. So right here, it's showing me that, hey, this is the normal profile for this SRX 906LA, and I'm using an 80 Hertz crossover. And then additional filtering. So this is EQ across the line array in its entirety. So that's the array size compensation filter. So it's just showing you what's happening there. And then on a per box or per circuit basis, I can do throw distance compensation. So this is essentially a very specifically formulated high shelf that I could put on each box to help make the high frequencies feather down more evenly from front to back in my audience. So this is now becoming more normal in closed ecosystem design suites that you can do this. And so when I'm looking at the data, I want to ask like, okay, I want to get most of the way there with the mechanical design. What did you have to do additionally from a processing standpoint to get there? Now moving on lastly to acoustics and summation calculations. So what's happening here is in venue synthesis, I could actually select a boundary plane. So above, below, or behind the speaker. So if I have a speaker that's being hung, and I'm looking at straight on a line array here, I can say, hey, here is this boundary that's above it that's now going to serve as a place to have reflections, or could be below it or behind it. So I can basically simulate the acoustic effects of having a close boundary and sound reflecting from behind that speaker or above it or below it to where we are at. Not many design softwares have this, or I guess more and more have it, but this is kind of a weird tug of war in that we as system designers are always subject to a room. I've never designed a system that did not go in a room or didn't have a floor. Borrowed that from Jamie Anderson. So all that being said, I can't always take that into account. I can go on site and get impulse responses and do fancy pants modeling, and that is all well and good. But these design principles still stand even without the room. So it is helpful to model if you can, but it's not the end all be all. We also can take into account reflections. So some design softwares do this. This is way back in Map XT, and I actually turned on the boundary here where I had a speaker pointed where the arrows are, and it shows me the sound reflecting off that wall. And then this shows me complex summation. So this is a top-down or plan view look at two different subwoofers at 63 Hertz. And this is showing me the power alleys and valleys here because they are offset with distance, therefore in time, and show me where they're combining and canceling each other out. So not all design softwares have the ability to do complex summation at all frequencies. So definitely dive into the settings and see what you got. And bottom line, even though we've covered a lot here, heat maps are just one way to look at the data. So just within venue synthesis, we could also look at venue over distance. So if I move into the 2D mode, I'm looking at the array right. And I can see here at the front row, we're 16 feet away from the array. If I'm looking at the frequency range of 1K to 12.5K, it's 98.5 dB. And then now if I move here to the bottom right, if I move 76 feet away from the array is now down to 94 dB. So that's a 4.5 decibel difference. So that's pretty cool because 4.5 dB, let's do a little bit of math here. If we pop over here to my audio math survival spreadsheet, which you can get at the link below, I can compare and see how effective we're using a line array to overcome or actually leverage physics to our advantage. So the decibel change that's actually realized is 4.5 dB, at least within that specific frequency range. So a 4.5 dB change is equivalent, if we increase it, to a 68% increase. So we've added 68%, or there's a 68% delta front to back. It is my goal to get it under 6 dB or under a doubling or halving of energy as we move from front to back. So here's what it should have been if we're just looking at the raw physics of it. If it did go from 16.24 feet at the very front, and that is right here, from this box to throw from here is 16.24 feet, and then from this box to throw all the way to the back is 76.74. So that range ratio actually should have been a 13.5 dB change, but because of how we've structured the line array, we've been able to cut it down from 13.5 minus 4.5, so we reduced that by 9 dB, which is really cool. So that's why it pays to have good design. And this is no processing yet, this is just mechanical design, but that's the power of leveraging the tools available to you to help make things more uniform. So had to get nerdy there for a minute, really cool. In addition to level over distance, we could look at that in a more granular way of seeing the actual magnitude response. So if I were tuning this system, this is exactly what I would do. I'll go on axis with this main array here, and I'll place a microphone in the front row, in the back row, and then evenly spaced here. I could also subdivide the array up into zones and place them in the middle of those array zones. Both those are viable. If I had time, I actually might do both, and I would shade accordingly. But this shows me the frequency response here below. So again, not the end-all be-all data point, a really important one, but this is the other types of information I'm looking to get out of my design software. Lastly, we can see a distribution graph. This is a cool one within Ease Focus 3, and I'm assuming within the higher levels of Ease. So these are 3 decibel class widths. This is a different design for a different church, but this is broadband pink noise stimulus signal, and it is showing me with it A-weighted, and I can see that the audience was within plus or minus a dB and a half, 70% of it, which is awesome. And if we move out farther, between plus or minus 3 dB If we look at the outliers here, that's 1.1, 1.6. So it's essentially 97% of the audience is within a plus or minus 6 dB span, which is really good for me. I also want to make clear what is not shown with this mapping data and other aspects we have not yet covered. This is speech transmission index, indicating a clarity of speech within a space. This requires acoustical data, the reverb time, so how long are frequencies hanging out, the direct to reverb ratio, any reflections in the space, and the actual sound of the space. We can be looking at this data, but what does it actually sound like to be in the space? So I just want to say that looking at any of the data we've mentioned previous is just a part of the puzzle. It's not the complete picture, but will help us go in the right direction. So now I want to end with what is the list of questions that would be good for you to be armed with when you're either creating data on your own or assessing data from a client side. So I'll go through each of these 6 categories and kind of recap questions that we asked. So is the audience area accurate? Is what you're showing me where people are actually going to be? Is this a seated or standing audience? And what does it look like on the stage? Do you have that included? Moving on to sources, what sources are on in the current coverage map? So this is all speakers, just one of the arrays. Are the front fills on? What about the relays as systems get more complex? And then also, can you show me isolated pictures of each zone and then how the coverage scheme is laid out? So could you solo just the main right, solo just the front fills? What do the subs look like? It is helpful to see how the entire system is performing, but knowing each of its subsystems is also really helpful to determining how effective it is. Moving on to signal type, frequency range, and weighting, I'm also going to throw scale in here as well. Some helpful parameters and things I look at often is was the full rig with a weighted peak noise in 3 dB steps, the full rig broadband peak noise in 3 dB steps, so it's including more of the low mids and how that's propagating over the space. I'm going to solo the subs and look at 40 Hertz, 63, and 80 at 1/3 octave and 3 dB steps. So this gives me a more granular look at how the subs are performing in their coverage shape. I want to look at the mains only, look at the A-weighted max SPL. So what I did, I drove them into limit and see what we got, and then do same with the subs. Because oftentimes we need subwoofers to be louder than the mains from a pure SPL standpoint in the room, oftentimes up to 15 or 20 dB louder. So I want to see how much headroom do we have on the mains, and then with the amount of subs I've spec'd, if we push them to, can they get 15 dB over the mains? Then lastly, it's also helpful to look at level over distance, frequency response over distance, the distribution graph, and any other acoustical data we can get our hands on. And processing, is there any EQ involved? Across the full rig or per zone, are the right presets loaded up? Is that all good to go? What's the crossover or frequency divider at for the mains and the subs? Are you using any gain shading? So this is within the line array, are you shading the array to get the colors to match more? I did this early on. I don't advocate you do it. Sometimes you have to if you're under very specific circumstances, but within a normal line array setup with any amount of trim height, you probably won't have to do it. I used to, and I have a video on this, how I screwed up a $200,000 sound system, is I took the top box of an 8-box array pointing at the front row, got the bottom box with split angles to point at the bottom, and then I just adjusted the gain of each box to where the color was all the same. I don't advocate you do this, but I was able to make it all the same color, which wasn't the right outcome I needed in this specific circumstance. And lastly, are there any zone level offsets? So this might be me shading down the front fills to be appropriate level for the front rows, then hand off the mains. What about the subs? Am I having to gas the input to the subs to get them to be over the mains? How much headroom do I have? All that is within processing. And then lastly, with acoustics and summation calcs, is this complex summation? Is this showing me what's actually happening as the zones are interacting? And is there any acoustical data included in this, with most design softwares not having it, especially if it's a closed ecosystem? All right, just a very quick recap here. I want you to ask the right question or set of questions. And we've talked about how even is the coverage throughout my audience? That's a great question to answer. How much headroom do I have in my system? And then that question will guide the necessary parameters. So then define the audience area, the sources you need on, the signal type you need to use, the scale at which you need to look things at, and the necessary processing. All right, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Hopefully this made being able to interpret and read heat maps and know what to do with them better for you as far as a design standpoint, as well as interpreting them as an end client. My name is Michael Curtis. I love helping you make your sound system sound incredible in every seat. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I will catch you next time.